The Widows of Kentucky, a story too cruel for the newspapers of the time to tell. In the shadow of the Cumberland Mountains, where mist clings to hollows like secrets to a troubled soul, the forgotten tale of two women lies, women whose lives became entangled in ways society dared not speak of in 1892. This is the narrative that never made it to the front pages, a story the journalists of the Louisville Courier deemed too disturbing for public consumption. Our journey begins in Harlan County, Kentucky, a place where the cold dust blackened the lungs of men who descended daily into the earth's depths. Where isolation wasn't just geographic, but was also generational. The Blackwood Hollow, as locals called it, housed no more than 17 families, most of whom had settled there following the Civil War. Among these families were the Caldwells and the Harrises, families whose bloodlines would become fatefully intertwined. Clara Caldwell, born in 1858, was known throughout the Hollow for her striking appearance, hair as dark as coal, eyes the color of a winter sky, and a manner that suggested education beyond her modest surroundings. Her father, Jeremiah Caldwell, had been a school teacher before the war claimed his left leg and much of his former ambition. His books and his bitterness, Clara had absorbed in equal measure. Just 2 miles up the same creek lived the Harris family, headed by William Harris, a man whose temper was as legendary as his skill with a hunting rifle. His daughter May, born within weeks of Clara in the same year, had grown up wild as the mountain laurel that covers the hillsides each spring. Where Clara was reserved, May was all flame and fury, a contrast that would later make their connection all the more incomprehensible to those who witnessed it. These weren't simple mountain folk as outsiders might imagine, explains Dr. Eleanor Sutton, a historian at the University of Kentucky who has studied isolated Appalachian communities. These were complex individuals, shaped by harsh environments, limited resources, and the intricate social codes that develop when people live in such close proximity for generations. By 1876, both young women had married, following the expected path for females in their community. Clara wed Thomas Blackwood, descendant of the Hollow's namesake and owner of the largest parcel of workable land. May married Ezra Jenkins, a coal miner whose gentle nature seemed to temper her wildness. For a time, life proceeded as one might expect. Children were born, crops were planted and harvested, and the wheel of seasons turned. What happened next wasn't recorded in any official document, but according to testimonies gathered decades later by a traveling physician documenting unusual medical cases, both women were widowed within months of each other in 1882. Thomas Blackwood fell from a cliff while hunting, while Ezra Jenkins never emerged from a mine collapse that claimed 7 other men. In their grief, Clara and May found solace in each other's company, an arrangement that seemed as practical as it was compassionate. What many outside observers failed to understand was that in isolated communities, survival often dictated social arrangements that might seem unusual by urban standards. Dr. Sutton notes that 2 widows combining households wasn't uncommon, resources were scarce and mutual support was essential. What remained hidden, however, was the truth about Clara and May's relationship. A truth that came to light only after the birth of a child in 1885. A child whose appearance raised questions that no one dared ask aloud. A child who would eventually reveal a family secret stretching back 3 generations. The facts emerged slowly, like water seeping through limestone. Clara and May weren't simply neighbors who had married into different families. They shared a grandfather, Jackson Caldwell, who had fathered children with 2 sisters back in the 1830s. Clara and May were first cousins, a connection that had been obscured through years of selective storytelling and deliberate omissions in family Bibles. But the revelation of their shared bloodline was merely the beginning of the story. What followed would challenge the Hollow's unwritten codes, test the limits of community tolerance, and ultimately lead to consequences that would echo through generations of both families. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel. You won't find these shocking historical accounts of isolated American communities and their hidden practices in any textbook. The truth about our past is often buried beneath layers of shame and silence. And only here do we dare to excavate these forgotten stories. The question that haunted Blackwood Hollow in the winter of 1885 wasn't merely about the nature of Clara and May's relationship. It was about the child who arrived during the year's first snowfall, a boy they named Samuel, a boy with features that seemed to belong to neither woman's late husband, but rather reflected the striking similarities between Clara and May themselves. In isolated communities before modern genetic understanding, people recognized that something wasn't right when certain patterns of family formation occurred, explains Dr. Thomas Harrington, a medical historian specializing in rural healthcare practices of the 19th century. They didn't have the scientific terminology we use today, but they observed the outcomes. The Hollow's midwife, Eunice Fletcher, was the first to notice the troubling signs. Samuel was born with a club foot, and as he grew, his development lagged noticeably behind other children his age. By his 3rd year, he had spoken only a handful of words, and his eyes, unusually close-set, seemed to focus on things others couldn't see. What complicated the situation further was a revelation that emerged through a chance encounter with a traveling peddler in 1887. This man, Joseph Miller, recognized May from his previous visit to another county entirely, Pike County, where May had apparently lived briefly before arriving in Harland. According to Miller, May had been known there by a different name and had been married not to Ezra Jenkins, but to a man named Harris, her own cousin. Record-keeping was spotty at best in these remote areas, notes county historian Margaret Wilson. People could effectively reinvent themselves by moving just 20 miles away. Without formal documentation, one's history became whatever one claimed it to be. The peddler's gossip spread through the Hollow like wildfire. Suddenly, the close relationship between Clara and May took on new dimensions. If May had previously married within her bloodline, what was the nature of her connection to Clara? And more disturbingly, who was Samuel's father? Clara, confronted by the community's whispers, withdrew further into the cabin she shared with May. May, however, responded with characteristic defiance. When the local pastor, Reverend Simmons, came to counsel them about living in ways pleasing to the Lord, May reportedly chased him off the property with her late husband's shotgun. The isolation that followed was both imposed and chosen. Families who had previously traded with the two women stopped coming by. Children were forbidden from playing with young Samuel. Even the monthly supply wagon would leave parcels at the edge of their property rather than approach the cabin directly. By 1890, Samuel's condition had worsened. Now 5 years old, he suffered from seizures that would leave him rigid and gasping for breath. His vision seemed to fail him intermittently, and the deformities that had been subtle in infancy became more pronounced as he grew. A letter discovered decades later, written by Clara to a doctor in Lexington but never sent, describes the child's symptoms in heartbreaking detail and ended with a plea: "If there is something in our blood that has caused this suffering, I bear that burden. But I beg you, tell us if there is any relief to be found for the boy." The letter reveals what medical science of the time was just beginning to understand, that certain conditions occurred with higher frequency when close relatives produced offspring. The term consanguinity was already in use in medical literature, though its full implications weren't widely known outside academic circles. By the late 19th century, medical journals were publishing case studies on the health outcomes of consanguineous relationships, Dr. Harrington explains. But this knowledge hadn't penetrated isolated rural communities where such practices sometimes continued due to geographic isolation, cultural norms, or simply lack of other options. The winter of 1891 brought tragedy to the cabin in Blackwood Hollow. Samuel, whose health had been declining steadily, died during a particularly severe seizure. No death certificate was filed, not unusual for the time and place, but the local carpenter, who had grudgingly agreed to build a small coffin, reported that the boy's body showed signs of severe malnutrition and other ailments beyond the visible deformities. Samuel's death marked a turning point in the community's response to Clara and May. Pity began to soften some of the harder edges of judgment. The pastor's wife brought food. A neighbor helped dig the grave on the small rise behind the cabin. But beneath this thin veneer of compassion, questions continued to swirl. Questions about blood, family, and choices that would soon force their way into the light. As spring returned to the mountains in 1892, bringing with it the riot of dogwood blossoms and the gentle unfurling of fern fronds, Clara and May faced a new challenge. Clara's health began to decline rapidly, her once vibrant eyes growing dull, her slender frame becoming gaunt despite May's desperate attempts to entice her with foraged spring greens and the season's first berries. What ailed Clara wasn't immediately apparent, even to the circuit-riding doctor who visited Blackwood Hollow every third month. Dr. James Whittaker recorded in his journal, recently discovered in an attic in Lexington, the Caldwell woman presents with extreme fatigue, joint pain, and a peculiar yellowing of the skin and eyes. Without proper facilities for examination, I can only surmise some disorder of the liver, perhaps exacerbated by melancholy following the child's passing. But May suspected something else entirely, something she revealed only in a moment of desperation to Eunice Fletcher, the midwife who had delivered Samuel. According to Fletcher's diary, May spoke of a family sickness that had claimed her mother at roughly the same age Clara had now reached. She described it as the blood turning against itself, a condition that modern medicine would likely identify as one of several genetic disorders that appear with higher frequency in consanguineous relationships across multiple generations. What May was describing aligns with autosomal recessive disorders that can remain hidden for generations, then suddenly appear when carriers of the same recessive gene have children together, explains Dr. Eleanor Richards, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins University. In isolated communities where intermarriage was common, these disorders could become concentrated in family lines. As Clara's condition worsened, May became increasingly forthcoming about their shared history to Eunice Fletcher, who continued to visit despite community disapproval. May revealed the complex web of relationships that connected their families across generations. "I want you to tell my story when I'm gone," May reportedly told Fletcher. "Tell them how it happened so others might be spared." The story May shared was one of calculated choices rather than ignorance or accident. The Harris and Caldwell families had deliberately intermarried since their arrival in Kentucky following the Revolutionary War, believing that keeping property and bloodlines pure was essential to maintaining their status and wealth. This practice had begun as marriages between cousins, but by the time Clara and May were born, the familial connections had become so intricate that distinctions like first cousin or second cousin barely captured the complexity of their shared ancestry. If you've made it this far into our story, you clearly care about understanding the hidden histories of America's isolated communities. Take a moment right now to type "I hear their voices" in the comments below. Your engagement helps preserve these forgotten stories for future generations. May's confession to Eunice Fletcher revealed something even more disturbing. Samuel wasn't the result of an unknown third party or a previous relationship. He was the product of a deliberate arrangement between the two women and Thomas Blackwood, Clara's husband, before his death. The plan, conceived after May's husband, Ezra, had been injured in a mining accident that left him unable to father children, was for Thomas to provide both women with children, maintaining what they believed to be their superior bloodline. This kind of arrangement wasn't unheard of in certain isolated communities, notes cultural anthropologist Dr. William Hayes. While shocking to modern sensibilities, we must understand it within the context of people who had developed their own moral frameworks in isolation, often based on misunderstandings of biblical passages about keeping blood pure or practical concerns about property inheritance. When Thomas died unexpectedly, May and Clara continued their living arrangement, but the plan for children remained. What happened next was pieced together from Fletcher's diary and later interviews with elderly residents conducted in the 1930s by WPA folklore collectors. Clara and May turned to Clara's half-brother, Jonathan Caldwell, who lived in a neighboring hollow. Jonathan himself, the product of a union between first cousins, agreed to father a child with May. That child was Samuel. The revelation explains much about Samuel's medical conditions. With parents who shared so much genetic material, the boy had effectively received doubled copies of recessive genes carrying disorders that might otherwise have remained hidden. His short life was the tragic consequence of generations of consanguinity. As summer approached, Clara's condition deteriorated rapidly. May, desperate for help, finally broke their isolation completely and sought assistance from the community that had shunned them. The response was mixed. Some families refused to become involved, citing the women's unnatural ways, while others, moved by basic human compassion, provided food and basic care. Clara died on June 18, 1892. No doctor was present, but Fletcher's diary described symptoms consistent with hepatic encephalopathy, the end stage of several genetic liver disorders. Clara was buried beside Samuel on the hillside behind the cabin with only May, Fletcher, and the pastor in attendance. What would happen to May in the aftermath would challenge the community's moral boundaries even further and ultimately lead to a tragedy that would forever change Blackwood Hollow. In the aftermath of Clara's death, May Harris found herself entirely alone for the first time in her adult life. The cabin that had once housed 2 families, then 2 widows and a child, now echoed with absence. According to Eunice Fletcher's diary entries from July 1892, May began to display increasingly erratic behavior, talking to herself, wandering the property at night, and sometimes appearing at neighbors' homes disoriented and speaking of Clara as if she were still alive. The psychological impact of isolation, compounded by grief and possibly the cognitive effects of shared genetic disorders, can manifest in ways that 19th-century communities would have struggled to understand, explains Dr. Rachel Montgomery, a clinical psychologist specializing in rural mental health. What May experienced was likely a combination of complicated grief, possible genetic conditions affecting cognition, and the trauma of social rejection. The community's response to May's deterioration reflected the complex moral calculations of the time. While some advocated for her removal to the state asylum in Lexington, others argued that Christian charity demanded local care. The debate became a proxy for larger questions about the Hollow's identity, questions that had simmered beneath the surface since Clara and May's relationship had first raised eyebrows. Reverend Simmons, who had once been chased from their property, emerged as an unexpected advocate for May. In a letter to the county judge dated August 15, 1892, he wrote, "While the circumstances of Mrs. Harris's life choices cannot be condoned, neither can we abandon one of our own to the cold care of strangers. Her present affliction may indeed be the Lord's judgment, but he calls us to temper judgment with mercy." The letter offers a window into how rural communities navigated the tension between moral disapproval and practical compassion. May was, despite everything, still considered one of their own, a status that carried obligations regardless of her perceived transgressions. A temporary solution emerged when Eunice Fletcher offered to take May into her home. Fletcher, widowed herself and childless, had the space and skills to provide basic care. More importantly, as the community's midwife, she occupied a unique social position respected for her essential role, but somewhat separate from the ordinary social hierarchies that govern most relationships. Fletcher's diary from this period provides the most detailed account of May's mental and physical decline. The entries describe nightmares that left May screaming about the bloodsickness and children born wrong. She would sometimes become convinced that Fletcher was trying to poison her, a paranoia that modern medicine might recognize as a symptom of certain neurological conditions with genetic components. Most significantly, Fletcher recorded May's more lucid confessions about the Harris and Caldwell family histories. According to these accounts, the practice of consanguineous marriages had been established by the family patriarchs in the 1790s, initially as a strategy to preserve land holdings. Over generations, it had evolved into something closer to a family doctrine, supported by selective readings of scripture and reinforced by increasing isolation from outside communities. By the 3rd generation of intermarriage, physical and cognitive differences would have become apparent, notes Dr. Richards, the geneticist. But without scientific understanding, these might be attributed to divine punishment, witchcraft, or simply bad luck rather than recognized as the predictable outcome of genetic relatedness. May revealed to Fletcher that her own parents had been uncle and niece, though this relationship had been disguised through a nominal adoption that made them appear unrelated on paper. Clara's parentage was similarly complex. Her mother was technically her father's half-niece, though this connection had been obscured by remarriages and name changes. The elaborate efforts to conceal these relationships from outsiders suggests an awareness that broader society condemns such practices, observes cultural historian Dr. Patricia Lawson. Even in isolation, these families maintained enough connection to the outside world to understand they were violating taboos, even if they justified those violations privately. The most disturbing revelation in Fletcher's diary comes from an entry dated September 3, 1892. May, in a moment of unusual clarity, described a family Bible kept hidden beneath a floorboard in the cabin she had shared with Clara. This Bible, according to May, contained the true family tree, one that documented the actual relationships rather than the public fiction maintained for outsiders. Fletcher, moved by curiosity or concern, visited the abandoned cabin and found the Bible exactly where May had described it. The document, now preserved in the Kentucky Historical Society archives, reveals 7 generations of intermarriage beginning in 1790, with patterns that became increasingly complex over time. Names repeat with disturbing frequency, and notations beside some entries, weak mind, blue baby, failed to thrive, hint at the genetic consequences that accumulated over decades. As autumn approached, May's condition worsened dramatically. Fletcher's diary described seizures similar to those Samuel had experienced, along with periods of complete dissociation during which May would speak in childlike tones about going home to mother. By October, Fletcher was exhausted from providing constant care and finally appealed to the community for additional help. The response to this appeal would reveal both the best and worst of the Hollow's character, leading to a confrontation that would permanently alter how the community understood itself and its responsibilities to even its most troubled members. The crisp October air carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves as a group of men gathered outside Eunice Fletcher's cabin on the morning of October 12, 1892. Led by William Crawford, a deacon in Reverend Simmons Church, they had come with a wagon and documentation signed by the county judge, papers authorizing May's removal to the Eastern Kentucky Asylum for the Insane in Lexington. Fletcher's diary describes her desperate attempts to prevent May's removal. "I pleaded with them to give her more time. Told them she was in no condition to travel. Mr. Crawford said they had Christian duty and mind that she would receive proper medical attention in Lexington that I could not provide." Behind his words, I heard the Hollow's desire to remove the evidence of its shame. The confrontation that followed was witnessed by several community members and recorded in multiple sources. May, hearing the commotion, emerged from the cabin with surprising lucidity. According to Martha Simmons, the pastor's wife, May stood on the porch and addressed the gathered crowd, "You've come to lock away what you can't bear to see. But removing me won't cleanse what flows in the veins of half this Hollow. Your grandfathers knew my grandfathers too well, and those sins don't wash away in one generation." Her words struck at the uncomfortable truth that the Harris Caldwell practice of consanguinity hadn't occurred in complete isolation. Other families in the Hollow had intermarried over generations, though perhaps not as systematically. May's removal wasn't merely about her individual circumstances. It represented the community's attempt to distance itself from practices that many had participated in to lesser degrees. What May described reflects a common pattern in isolated communities, explains sociologist Dr. Jennifer Marshall. Often a single family or individual becomes the repository for community shame, the scapegoat whose removal allows others to maintain the fiction that the problem has been addressed without confronting the broader patterns that enabled it. Despite Fletcher's objections and May's resistance, the men loaded her into the wagon. The journey to Lexington would take nearly 3 days over rough mountain roads. Fletcher, denied permission to accompany May, instead gave her a small package containing personal items and, secretly, the family Bible that documented the true Harris Caldwell lineage. May Harris was admitted to the Eastern Kentucky Asylum on October 15, 1892. Her intake records, discovered during the institution's closure in the 1960s, described her as suffering from hereditary melancholia and delusions of persecution. The examining physician noted physical stigmata suggesting degenerative heredity, a pseudoscientific concept of the time that incorrectly linked physical features to moral and mental qualities. The medical understanding of the era meant that May received little true treatment during her institutionalization. Notes in her file indicate periods of lucidity alternating with severe confusion, physical deterioration consistent with progressive neurological disorders, and occasional violent outbursts when staff attempted to separate her from the family Bible she kept constantly with her. May died in the asylum on November 28, 1892, just 6 weeks after her admission. The cause of death was listed as exhaustion from acute mania, though modern medical analysis of the described symptoms suggests she likely suffered from the same genetic disorder that had claimed Clara months earlier. What makes May's story historically significant isn't just the personal tragedy, but what happened to the family Bible she had protected so fiercely. Dr. Howard Jenkins, a young physician working at the asylum, noted the unusual document among May's possessions after her death. Recognizing its potential scientific value at a time when heredity was becoming a subject of serious study, He retained the Bible rather than disposing of it with May's other effects. Jenkins would later become a pioneer in the emerging field of genetics, and the Harris Caldwell Bible became one of the earliest documented case studies of the health consequences of multigenerational consanguinity. His 1908 paper, Hereditary Degeneration and Isolated Communities, drew heavily from the family records, though he anonymized the names out of what he called professional courtesy to the living. Back in Blackwood Hollow, May's departure and subsequent death created a vacuum quickly filled by silence. Fletcher's diary entries from late 1892 describe how the community seemed to collectively agree never to speak of Clara and May again. Their cabin was demolished, the timber salvaged for other uses. The small cemetery on the hillside where Clara and Samuel were buried was left to be reclaimed by the forest. This pattern of enforced forgetting is common in communities confronting uncomfortable histories, notes Dr. Lawson, the cultural historian. Rather than integrating difficult truths into their communal narrative, they opt for erasure, creating historical gaps that later generations struggle to understand. The silence held for decades. When WPA folklorists visited the area in the 1930s, they found older residents reluctant to discuss the Hollow's history before 1900. One collector noted, "There seems to be a missing generation in their stories. They'll speak freely of the Civil War era and of the early 1900s, but the intervening years are passed over quickly with eyes averted." It wasn't until 1967, when construction of a new highway uncovered the forgotten graves behind where the cabin stood, that the story began to resurface. The discovery prompted local historian Margaret Wilson to investigate, eventually leading her to Dr. Jenkins' papers and through them to the Harris Caldwell Bible, preserved in the University of Kentucky's medical archives. If you've stayed with us through this entire dark journey, you clearly appreciate the importance of preserving these difficult chapters of our history. Please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end so I can get to know who truly values these stories," and share this video with others who might appreciate these hidden historical narratives. Your engagement helps ensure that even the most uncomfortable truths about our past aren't lost to time. The legacy of Clara and May's story isn't just about the tragic consequences of consanguinity. It's about how communities respond to practices they can neither fully acknowledge nor completely disown. It's about the tension between judgment and mercy, between scientific understanding and moral tradition. Above all, it's about the human cost of silence, how the failure to confront difficult truths condemns others to repeat painful histories. Today, a small marker stands near the highway construction site that accidentally uncovered Clara and Samuel's remains. It doesn't bear their names or explain their story, just the dates 1858 to 1892 and 1885 to 1891. For those who know where to look, however, it serves as a reminder of the widows of Kentucky and the truths too cruel for the newspapers of their time to tell.